For time immemorial, drama and theater have been used by social elites to weave specific conceptions of virtue into the fabric of society, going back to the mystery religions of Egyptian and Greco-Roman antiquity. The ancients also developed a selective method for keeping esoteric wisdom in tight circles. These two distinct methods of information dissemination have often been described with the terms esoteric and exoteric. In his De Augmentis Scientiarum, the man credited with giving us the scientific method, Francis Bacon, compares and contrasts the two methodologies. Quote, "Both methods agree in aiming to separate the dull among the auditors from the select, but they vary in this, that one makes use of a way of delivery more open, the other a way of delivery more secret. Let one be distinguished as the exoteric method, the other, of which I am going to speak, is the achromatic, a distinction observed by the ancients chiefly in the publication of books, but which I transfer to the method of delivery itself. The ancients used it with judgment and discretion, but in later times it has been disgraced by many who have made it as a false and deceitful light in which to put forward their counterfeit merchandise. The intention, however, seems to be by obscurity of delivery to exclude the vulgar from the secrets of knowledge, and to admit those persons only who have received the interpretation of the enigmas through the hands of teachers, or have wits of such sharpness and discernment that they can of themselves pierce the veil." Unquote. Bacon lived at the end of the Renaissance period, so it isn't surprising to see such interest in ancient wisdom. In fact, the Renaissance was thus named precisely because of the renewed interest in ancient ideals which swept over Europe during that period. Ideals centered around art, architecture, magic, and theater. Other methods of crowd control which evolved from ancient times include bread and circuses, or generating public approval through superficial appeasement, centered around food and entertainment, as a way to distract attention away from civic matters. And of course the old Roman dictum, divide and conquer, both of which have evolved into far more sophisticated forms in the modern-day political discourse. Mass media evolved during the Renaissance not only in the physical sense, with the invention of the printing press, but also in the philosophical sense in the works of influential philosophers like Niccolò Machiavelli and Giordano Bruno, the works of whom are concerned with understanding and manipulating public opinion, and have become cornerstones of modern political thought. In his classic work Of Bonds in General, Bruno describes what he calls a magician, whose understanding of the phantasmic essence of the intellect and the role of the unconscious enable him to manipulate public perceptions. Former professor at the University of Chicago, Ion Petruculianu, examines Bruno's magician in his book Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. According to Culianu, Bruno's magician is someone with an understanding of Eros, or knowledge of his subjects' personalities and the complexity of their expectations. Such understanding enables the magician to, quote, impress upon the imagination certain mental states of attraction or aversion, of joy or revulsion, to forge all the chains he wants, hope, compassion, fear, love, hate, indignation, anger, joy, patience, disdain for life and death, or fortune. Culianu characterizes Bruno's magician as, quote, a prototype of the impersonal systems of mass media, indirect censorship, global manipulation, and the brain trusts that exercise their occult control over the Western masses. Both psychoanalyst and prophet, as well as the precursor of modern professions, such as director of public relations, propagandist, spy, politician, censor, director of mass communication media, and publicity agent. Nowadays, the magician busies himself with public relations, propaganda, market research, sociological surveys, publicity, information, counter-information, and misinformation, censorship, espionage, and even cryptography, a science which in the 16th century was a branch of magic, unquote. And it seems quite telling that ideas such as cryptology, mnemonics, and the art of memory were actually considered to be branches of magic during the Renaissance, and that far from being a superstition that we outgrew after the rise of Enlightenment science and rationalism, magic was much closer to something that social elites wanted to corral and keep the masses away from. Like so many technologies, magic was too potentially useful for too many and therefore too threatening. Yet mysteriously, today we largely look upon magic as, in Culianu's words, quote, a merely ludicrous heap of recipes and methods stemming from primitive, unscientific notions about nature, unquote. In his book The Shakespeare Enigma, author Peter Dawkins describes the science of cryptology in Elizabethan England, which had become an effective and important part of statecraft, adding that today, Francis Bacon's bilateral cipher, quote, in the form of the binary system, is the basis of all computer language, unquote. Back then, however, this kind of knowledge was considered to be magic, and one could be burned at the stake for being involved with it, like Giordano Bruno was. On the other hand, the Queen's intelligencers, like Francis Bacon's brother Anthony, used it routinely and without repercussion. Dawkins describes the English Renaissance as a golden age and a beginning of the modern era. Major themes involved particular conceptions of virtue, law, and order. According to Dawkins, the Tudors sought to enlarge and enhance the Arthurian ideal, adding that it was particularly during the reign of Elizabeth I that, quote, the full pageantry and drama, complete with tournaments in the Arthurian style, were instituted on a grand scale to celebrate the chivalric ideal, unquote. Dawkins also notes the importance of the theater and drama in the dissemination of recondite knowledge, where, quote, the emotions can be experienced and their results seen in a highlighted way. Besides the emotional effect, good drama has an inspirational and educational value, far beyond what can be achieved in a more academic environment. This is, in fact, an ancient way of learning, having its origins in the classical mystery schools, unquote. The Shakespeare corpus alone has been so influential that it is thought of by many scholars as having not only changed society, but as having actually helped to create a new era, the modern era. And for almost 200 years now, many have believed William Shakespeare couldn't possibly have produced such writings, and that the works would have to have been authored by a more well-connected individual, or individuals, of the higher class who are much more familiar with the law and matters of court. This controversy has resulted in the proposition of over 80 potential candidates, as well as another popular theory suggesting the works were authored by a literary society, or scrivenery, consisting of the best and brightest of that period, a collaboration, or shake scene, with close connections to royalty and vested interests in shaping society in particular ways and promoting narratives in keeping with their interests. Thus, during the Renaissance period, esoteric disciplines such as alchemy, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah, all of which tend to share core tenets with the mysteries of Egyptian and Greco-Roman antiquity, once again became the center of attention. The House of Medici patronized a host of artists, philosophers, and polymaths, including Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, who were influenced by occult sciences. Cosimo de' Medici was a lifelong patron of Marsilio Ficino, astrologer and reviver of Neoplatonism, who produced translations of Neoplatonic and Hermetic manuscripts at the behest of Cosimo. Cosimo refounded Plato's Academy in the early 1460s, choosing Ficino as its head. Advisor to Queen Elizabeth, William Cecil, used knowledge of occult science to conduct medical and personal matters for the Queen, as well as matters of court. Polymath John Dee, another advisor to Queen Elizabeth and one of the greatest minds of the Elizabethan era, immersed himself in magic, sorcery, astrology, Hermetic and alchemical philosophy. Dee is also said to have possessed one of the greatest libraries in all of England. While the modern-day conception of magic is that of a silly superstition we outgrew with the rise of rationalism and science, it appears much more likely that magic was deliberately stigmatized in order to keep powerful knowledge in as few hands as possible, all the more since it proved to be so useful to social elites for controlling the public mind. And from ancient times to the Renaissance period to modern times, mass media and crowd control methodologies continue to evolve. In Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, Culianu goes on to point out that Gustave Le Bon's book, The Crowd, in 1895, laid the foundations of what is known today as mass psychology, which was later developed by Sigmund Freud. And of course today, computers, the World Wide Web, and social media have taken all this to another level entirely. In fact, Sigmund Freud's nephew, Ed Bernays, became a pioneer in the field of public relations, and is thought of by many as the very father of public relations, authoring aptly named books like Crystallizing Public Opinion in 1923, Propaganda in 1928, and Engineering of Consent in 1947. Not to be outdone by his uncle Sigmund, Bernays conducted PR campaigns for the most prominent economic interests, like Procter & Gamble, the American Tobacco Company, and General Electric, as well as working in Woodrow Wilson's Department of War. His campaign for cigarette branding in the 1920s is now famous for the use of the phrase, torches of freedom, in order to convince women to associate smoking cigarettes with women's rights and the good life. He also did PR work for United Fruit Company operating in Guatemala, facilitating the overthrow of the democratically elected Guatemalan government. In his book, Propaganda, in 1928, Bernays writes, "We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses.